Welcome. Scott here. Here is a quick boss guide for the upcoming story event, Act 3 Chapter 9 Part 1 Vanishing Scenery. The synergy units for the event are the Lunafreya, Lion, Basch, Ultimecia, Yang, and Setzer. The featured units will be getting their force enhancement boards unlocked. Lunafreya will be making her debut with her full kit. Lunafreya, Ultimecia, Lion and Yang will be getting their C90 Awakening and reworks. We will be fighting Ultimecia, who will be accompanied with the Co-Earl. Ultimecia has 85 million HP while the Co-Earl has 60 million HP. They are immune to launches. The Co-Earl resists thunder element attacks. The turn requirement is 75. The HP requirements is 8000. Before I continue further, here is a small disclaimer clause for the video. The guide is written based on the time that the event was released for the Japanese version. Please do note that it is possible that the boss fight mechanics might differ when the actual event is released in global. As we are no longer have Luthania Plus fights, the boss guide will be focused primarily on Shinryu fights. In Shinryu, you need to understand the effects gained by the boss as the force gauge build up, its force ability and its force time effect. As your party has low force levels at the start of the era, it is highly certain that the boss force gauge will build up faster than yours. To have a better understanding on the basics of the force gauge mechanics and Shinryu fights, I have done a video explaining the mechanics. I have included the link to the video under the comments and video description for your quick reference. For this fight, the boss force gauge is broken into 3 thresholds. When the boss gauge is more or equal to 40%, the boss party will raise its turn rate by 10% and boost their attack by 50%. When the boss gauge is more or equal to 60%, the boss party will raise its turn rate by 30% and boost their attack by 80%. When the boss gauge is more or equal to 80%, the boss party will raise its turn rate by 50% and boost their attack by 100%. The boss force gauge will build up faster as its HP is lowered. You can refer to the table on the screen for the percentages. This will have some mechanics that you need to watch out for. The Co-Earl could set some annoying debuffs varying from confusion or paralysis. Ultimecia could warp its turn and gains consecutive turns upon using its recast. If you are doing a hit and counter team, please do be mindful of the debuffs. Units like Yang, Ursula, Alphinaud, and Core who offer break immunity will be very useful for the fight. At the 100% threshold, Ultimecia will use its force ability, Apocalypse Plus and activates its force time for 2 turns. The boss force ability, Apocalypse Plus is a guaranteed hit which will set your Brave to 0 and AoE HP attack. Upon using the force ability, the boss will enter into its force time where the gauge will start to emit a red hue with counter of 2 on its gauge. When the force time is activated, every action taken by the boss will delete its target next turn. It is noted that force time won't decrease when Ultimecia boss has her overhead buff active. You need to wait for it lapse and it will be deactivated after the boss party act for 2 turns. To halt the enemy's force time, you need to use an Ice Elemental Magic Force ability which is Lunafreya FR. Alternatively with Ice Enchant, you can also use a Magic FR ability such as Charlotta, Terra, and Cloud of Darkness to halt the boss force time. For Ice Enchant, you can use Activate the Force ability while in Shiva Summon mode or use the following Ice Enchant call like Karaseme, Cater or bring an Ice Enchanter like Snow, Lunafreya, Onion Knight, or Celis in your party. Now let's proceed with some party setup recommendations. Recommended calls abilities. To ensure that you are able to constantly break them, it is important to inflict defense down debuffs. Example of calls abilities that inflict defense down calls are Ferris, Titus, Jack, and Vanille. To speed up the fight, using HP damage up debuff calls like Karaseme, Seymour, Fran, Ignis, Lilysette, Maria, and Dark Knight Cecil are useful. Although a bit trickier to use, Aura type HP damage up calls like Kamari, Alisai, Priyash, Leo and Locke are also viable. Most recently C90 units have aura type HP damage up bonuses. You can use Dissidia DB Call Finder to find out more. The Co-Earl can inflict lots of annoying debuffs. Thus, it is your best interest to cleanse them or bring a debuff evasion unit for your party. For debuff evasion, you can use Lena, Selphie, or Gladio. For debuff cleansing, you can bring Pernello, Mog or Sidor. Next, I will be covering units that will be useful to handle the fight mechanics. For any endgame fights like Luthania and Shinryu, it is always recommended to bring supports for their aura and buffs. You can consider bringing Aphmau, Lena, Charlotta, Yuna, Garnet, Horum, Rem, and Ramza. Lena can ensure your party is always safe with her powerful HP regen buffs, and she also provide debuff evasion utility, which is great to handle the Co-Earl's debuffs. As the turn count is tight, it is important that you complement with strong auras like Charlotta, Garnet, and Ramza. Aphmau is a great support for this fight for turn manipulation and debuff evasion utility. As the boss will take a lot of turns due to the turn rate up auras on themselves, and Ultimecia will be bound to trigger a HP attack every 2 turns, it is advisable to bring a damage mitigator if you doing a hit and counter run. You can consider Leela, Beatrix, Snow, Zack, Edge, Warrior of Light, Auron, and Golov. Evasion tanks like Leela, Golov, or Edge are great here. Leela excels in this fight and will help to keep the turn count lower with her evade and warp mechanics. Be careful when you are bringing Locke tanks, as Ultimecia could burn up your Locke buff easily with her turn spamming. For cover tanks, you need to be aware of the debuffs from Co-Earl, as this could prevent you from refreshing your cover buff. In addition to the support and tanks, you can bring the following units if you have them. As Ultimecia can accumulate turns in succession, other than bring a counter unit, you can also bring turn warp units like Relm or Shelke to disrupt their turns. Noctis is great for his turn manipulation utility, however his damage output may be hindered as the boss is immune to launches. Hope is great for blocking out buff slots against the annoying debuffs that the Co-Earl could inflict. Maria's LD debuff can offer nice off-turn healing, while her EX debuff can help to control the boss Brave game. Pain can offer great aura boost and nice debuff cleansing utility as well. Alphinaut and Core offers break immunity, which help a lot to minimize HP damage received. Optimal FR to use for this fight are Terra, Charlotta, Cloud of Darkness and Lunafreya. Lunafreya FR will offer True Water enchant, which will bypass enemies that absorb water element as well. Her FR condition are easy to fulfill, as the units just need to do HP attacks. Lunafreya has a very strong base kit that she makes setting up your party for an optimal FR phase with relatively easy. With Ice Enchant, you can halt the boss force time with other 3 FR. Terra FR will great for nuking strategies, and she can help a lot in reducing the turn count with her free turn spamming phase. Cloud of Darkness FR allows you to delay the boss away, thus buying you the turns to nuke the boss before they become dangerous. The FR also benefits a magic-oriented team and delay with breaks or no breaks. She has gained a significant upgrade with her C90 Awakenings. As Shinryu is about building up your force gauge chargers units are great to deploy here. Characteristics of Force Charger are: the unit have substantial amount of instant turn non-attacking abilities. At max force enhancement level 30, one such instant turn ability can supercharge the force gauge by a whopping 50%. You can easily amplify your force time damage by abusing the supercharging mechanics. Examples of such force gauge chargers units are Pernello, Kryle, Charlotta, Braska, and Ignis. Lunafreya also offers supercharging utility with her S1. For other recommendations, you can consider the following. For tanks, you can bring Warrior of Light and Auron. If you are using Auron, do considering bring a debuff evasion call. Yang and Ursula offer party-wide break immunity, which will help a lot to reduce the HP damage received. Other than offering his famous follow-up, Yang can also be used as a counter unit with his C90 Awakenings. Ursula is great for her party battery, warp mechanics along with her powerful FR ability. You can bring the standard damage nuker units like Machina, Titus, and Terra and nuke the boss with the FR-powered burst phase before they could activate their force time. Ultimecia, who gotten her C90 awakening, has also received great upgrades that will be useful for the fight. Setzer will help a lot with his rainbow-enabled utility, and his freeze joker can help you to negate the boss' powerful HP attacks. As the boss has lot of threshold attacks, it is highly advisable to support your party with great burst healing and strong HP Regans like Lena. Aphma is great here for her turn manipulation and debuff evasion utility. As the boss will do lots of AoE HP attacks, Bash will help to absorb the damage for the party. As the boss will gains lots of turn, Reno FR is pretty useful here. Even Ultimecia's attack are all magic based. His pyramid debuff can help to negate debuffs from Coeurl. On the screen, you will see a timeline showing the HP thresholds triggers that you need to watch out for. Like Lufania, Shinryu fights also features aura boosts for the boss when their HP are depleted to a certain threshold. The stats boosts are triggered at the start of the fight and 79%. Like other Shinryu fights, the enemy's force gauge will charge faster as their HP depletes. As the enemy's force gauge reaches 40% and above, the boss will raise their turn rate and attack. The boss party turns will start to get more frequent. The boss force ability Apocalypse ++ is set your party brave to 0, followed by a guaranteed AoE HP. Once its force time is activated, the boss party will delete the subsequent turn of which target they are attacking. It is also important to note that force time won't decrease when the Ultimecia boss has her overhead buff active. You can halt the force time by using Ice Elemental Magic FR ability. You can make use Ice Enchant to ensure your non-elemental magic FR like Charlotta, Terra, and Cloud of Darkness meet the conditions as well. At the start of the wave, Ultimecia will use Hell's Judgment to set your party brave to 1 and filled its recast gauge to max. At the 79%, 49%, and 19% HP threshold, Ultimecia will warp its turn forward and fill its recast gauge to the max. When Ultimecia's recast gauge is full, she will use Apocalypse followed by 2 instant turns. Ultimecia has a standard move rotation where she will go from Hell's Judgment to Shockwave Pulsar and followed by Holy. I will discuss in more in-depth on the rotation in later slides. If you activate the threshold in your burst or summon phase, Ultimecia will only warp its turn forward once you have exited the phase. If you skip the threshold, Ultimecia will just warp its turns forward. For example, if you nuke the boss HP from 50% to 18%, you will skip the HP triggers at 49% and 19%. Ultimecia will warp its turn, filled her recast gauge to max and warp its next turn and filled her recast gauge to max. Now let's talk briefly on the Coeurl. It has 2 stances, crouching and standing. It will switch stances after you have inflicted a certain number of breaks or have it taken number of turns. While it is in crouching stance, it will use its status ailment magic brave attacks that inflict a variety of ailments from confuse, paralysis and poison. While it was in standing posture, it will mainly use Rake, Bite and Coeurl Rush. Overall, this fight isn't that difficult as long as you have units that you can handle the mechanics. Evasion tanks like Leela, Glove, or Edge will have a nice field day in this battle. Counter units like Orin, Gladio, or Beatrix also works wonders here. However, you need to mindful of the timing to refresh your cover buff. When your cover tank is paralyzed or confused, it will get a bit tricky and difficult to ensure the safety of your party. It is highly recommend to bring debuff evasion or debuff cleansing call to handle the debuffs. Units with break immunity like Yang, Ursula, Alphinaud, and Core will work well for this fight as well. Now let's proceed with the boss mechanics proper. Similar to any Lufania fights, for Shinryu fights, the boss will also gain stats boosts and brave gain reduction auras when you deplete the boss's HP to a certain threshold. However, Shinryu bosses will also gain HP damage reduction auras as well. The threshold's trigger for this fight is at the start of the fight and 79% HP threshold. At the start of the fight, it will boost its defense stats by 200%. It will raise its Brave damage and Brave gain reduction auras to 80%. It will also reduce your HP damage dealt by 50%. At 79% HP threshold, it will further boost its defense stats to 300% and the HP damage dealt reduction auras to 80%. To handle the defense stats boost, you can inflict defense down calls. To handle the Brave gain reductions, you can bring a Brave gain up support like Agrias, Ram, or Quistis. With the recent units released, you shouldn't have any problem in handling the Brave gain or damage reduction auras. For HP damage reduction auras, HP damage up calls will only partly offset against the reductions. However, you can easily overwrite them with your party force time. As we progress through the era, we will gain access to units with FR that allows you to build up your force time HP damage bonuses up to 999%. Learning on how to take full advantage of the damage window in Shinryu fight holds the key on how to make Shinryu fights easier. Now, I will be covering the boss key mechanics in detail. The Ultimecia boss has a standard attack rotation cycle. Firstly, she will use Hell's Judgment, AoE magic Brave attack where it will set your party Brave to 1. Next, she will use Shockwave Pulsar which is a single target Brave plus HP attack that inflicts minus 20% defense down debuff. She will end her rotation with Holy, a single target Holy Elemental magic Brave attack. After that she will revert back to Hell's Judgment. Whenever her recast gauge is filled, she will use recast ability Apocalypse, followed by the next move in her rotation. At turn 0, Ultimecia will use Hell's Judgment and fill her recast gauge to full. Ultimecia's recast ability Apocalypse is a Brave gain, AoE Brave plus HP attack. Ultimecia will gain access to her overhead buff, which grants her 2 instant turns and her Griever magic framed buff that raises her max Brave and attack. It is noted that Ultimecia activates her force time with her overhead buff active, the force time won't decrease. However, I won't eliminate the possibility that this could be a bug though. Ultimecia will warp her turn forward at the following thresholds, 79%, 49%, and 19%. Once she warps her turn, she will fill her recast gauge to max and uses her recast ability, Apocalypse, and followed by the moves that are mentioned in her rotation earlier. If you activate the threshold in your burst or summon phase, Ultimecia will only warp her turn forward once you have exited the phase. If you skip the threshold, Ultimecia will just warp her turns forward. For example, if you nuke the boss HP from 50% to 18%, you will skip the HP triggers at 49% and 19%. Ultimecia will warp its turn, filled her recast gauge to max and warp its next turn and filled her recast gauge to max. You can make use of turn warper units like Rolm, Shelka, and Ursula to disrupt her consecutive turns. Counter or trap debuffs will also works here. It is important to note that the HP requirements is 8000. If you want to finish the fight, make sure you finish strong or have some mitigation utility like Wario of Light LDCA or Raijin LDCA to tank Ultimecia's consecutive turns onslaught. Let's cover a bit on the Ko'Earl boss. The boss has 2 stances, crouch and standing. It starts off the fight in its crouch stance. It will switch modes after a certain amount of turns or after you have inflicted a certain number of breaks. While in crouch stance, it will mainly use status ailment attacks. I will briefly cover its moveset. Do note that the Ko'Earl boss don't have a standard attack rotation unlike Ultimecia. It can use Byaga, a single magic Brave attack inflicts 3 turn poison debuff that scales off 60% of the target's initial Brave. It can use Confuse, a single target magic which could inflict Confuse debuff for 1 turn. The confused target could still act but most likely doing HP or Brave attack. After its HP is lowered to 49% and below, it will start to incorporate Blaster, an ability that sets the target Brave to 10% and inflicts 1 turn paralyzed debuff. To guard against all these status ailments, it is advisable to bring debuff evasion units or have debuff cleansing calls to handle the debuffs. It will be very tricky to handle for cover tank setup if your cover tank got disabled by the paralysis or confused debuff. You might face the situation where you are unable to refresh your cover buffs. Alternatively, you can also block all buff slots with 6 framed buffs. Units like Hope who can grant multiple framed buffs will be useful for this. While it is in standing stance, it will mainly use physical attacks that goes from Rake to Coeurl Rush. I have come to the last slide of the guide. By now, you should have a FR. Generally, you just charge up your force gauge. Have the FR unit activate their force time with their force ability. Prepare for a big damage phase either through a unit burst phase or supercharge the gauge with follow-up attacks like Kain or Freya. To build up the bonuses efficiently, you need bring a force gauge charger. Examples are Pernello, Kryle, Ignis, Charlotta, Braska or Lunafreya. At force level 30, these units can boost the force charge with 50% with their instant turn, non-attacking ability on top of the force time conditions. If you bring Kain or using Kain BT friend as support, have him activate his BT aura and let him stay in the air firing the lancets while your force gauge charger is spamming his or her instant turns. As the boss are immune to launch, you won't be able to abuse the Camlanaut powerful FR mechanics. However, Camlanaut still works well for his disable debuffs to prevent the boss acting consecutively. From this fight onwards, we will be introduced to the Queen of FR setup, Lunafreya. Lunafreya's strength is her powerful turn manipulation utility from her LD buff, and she can be used as a call slave if you don't intend to get her fully built. Personally, I recommend you to get her fully built because she will open up a vast variety of viable team comps. When her overhead buff Trident of Calling is at 4, her Brave and Attack commands will be replaced with her Quick Prayer and Heavy Prayer option. Quick Prayer buff grants the ally free and instant turns while the buff is active, which is great for setting up a big damage phase, whether it's FR into BT plus into BT phase or BT plus into FR or whatever combo you may need a couple turns in a row for. Heavy Prayer buff allows the ally with the buff to deal some extra true HP damage, not affected by HP damage up or FR bonus effects, based on 10% of the ally's HP damage limit. If you have her BT aura, the buffs granted will be extended by 1 turn, so it will give you a bigger attack window to abuse her turn manipulation utility. Now let's recap on the boss key mechanics. The boss, Ultimecia, has a standard attack rotation cycle, Hell Judgment, Shockwave Pulsar, and Holy. Prepare your Brave damage mitigation or bring Brave control utility to minimize the Brave that the boss could gain from those Brave hits. The Coeurl boss has 2 stances, Crouch and Standing Stance. While in Crouch stance, the Coeurl will use status ailment attacks, while in Standing stance, it will use its physical attacks. The debuff inflicted can be annoying. So, bring debuff evasion or debuff cleansing to handle them. Alternatively, you can block your buff slots with 6 framed buffs. At the start of the fight, Ultimecia will use Hell's Judgment, which set your Brave to 1. It will fill its recast gauge to max. At the 79%, 49%, and 19% HP threshold, Ultimecia will warp its turn forward and fill its recast gauge to max. Upon using her recast ability, Ultimecia will gain 2 instant turns. Do note, if Ultimecia activates her force time with her overhead buff active, force time won't reduce until her overhead buff is inactive. This could be a bug though. Now I will make a quick overview on the FR of the featured unit, Lunafreya. Lunafreya is one of the overhyped units. In my opinion, she really deserved so. She is the undisputed queen of FR setup, as setting FR phase optimally holds the key of finishing up the boss fight easily. Her FR is probably the weakest part of her kit, and it isn't mandatory and optional to build. However, the FR ability offers True Water Enchant, which allows her to be usable in Ice Absorb fights, and it has very easy to fulfill conditions. During her force time, dealing any form of HP or Brave attack with any unit will add 40% HP damage bonus. Her FR second condition is the one that you can abuse units that grant buff. Units that grant buffs while dealing HP attack can uptick the HP damage bonus by 60%. I listed the examples of them in the screen below. With this, I have come to the end of my boss guide presentation. Hopefully you find it useful. If you like the video, please give a like. Please subscribe to my channel for future gaming content. Good luck for the fight later. Bye.